All right, so this video I'm using to show in conjunction with the movie we saw on the Constitutional Convention that set up our government out of the ashes of the old Articles of Confederation, which didn't work at all. So this will be partially a review. It's going to cover the same stuff the movie covered and just kind of, again, show how it happened, how it kind of played out. But also add a couple of new dimensions to it as well the movie did not mention. So kind of want to get into that as well. And with that, we'll construct the basis of a government, the legislative branch. Now, this won't include the president. It's not going to talk about the court system yet. Just the basic structure we have in place to set up a lawmaking system that includes all of our states. So they do this from July through the summertime of 1787 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And as you probably recall, 12 of the 13 states showed up, especially once they realized, or at least were told anyway, that Washington was coming to lead them. They show up, and they are there to make this change to the Articles, which turns out to be a whole brand new government. So we're going to take a look at is kind of look at how they went through it based on the ideas that were proposed. Kind of the proposals are an idea that comes up in Congress. Someone proposes a thought, and we'll talk about how those proposals were greeted by the various factions, the groups of congresspeople and states that showed up. So the first proposal: let's get rid of the Articles of Confederation and start a brand new government from scratch. Now, all states kind of said, yeah, there's nothing good about the Articles because literally nothing about them worked well. Now, you can say that the system they used to create the new states in the West worked well, and it did. Technically speaking, though, that wasn't part of the Articles of Confederation. The rest of it, about 13 states acting like 13 separate countries, that's the part that didn't work well at all. And states decided that it would be better to get rid of them than keep them. Now, that wasn't easy to do because states did fear that if they gave up the Articles, that might be the first step to losing all of their power. So this decision did not come easily. I don't want you to think this was like a no-brainer slam dunk. And big wealthy states also thought, well, maybe we don't need to change quite as much. But they really weren't doing that well. The idea was that you might be doing better than some of the other states, but if the economy continues to drop, we all go down together. So after a lot of debate and easing the fear that, if we do kill this government, if we do get rid of the Articles, you're still going to be okay and have power to run yourself. Maybe not full power, but still some. How, we'll see. But once they got that idea that there was nothing they could do, that the Articles were just so bad they weren't worth saving, they did all agree to get rid of them. And there wasn't chaos because of this. It wasn't like we were operating without a government. The Articles were so weak that killing them really didn't do all that much in the first place. Because the states were already running themselves on a day-to-day basis. They controlled themselves like they were a little country. So getting rid of a government that didn't have any power anyway doesn't change the reality that the states will continue to run themselves the way they always have until a new government is put in. So that's why they didn't have any risk of getting rid of the other government. Nothing was going to change while they sat there in Philadelphia and tried to dream up a better solution. So the next thing was, how do you have a Congress that is going to make laws for all of us and do it fairly? One of the first plans was the New Jersey plan. Now, all states agreed that states can no longer ignore the national government. That they knew was going to have to go. But in that new national government, how are we going to set that up and how would power be distributed? Well, New Jersey said, let's have a Congress, just like now, and have every state have one vote, just like now. All states are equal. We all play for the same team. We shouldn't be putting states above each other if we're all part of this same team. That's what we want to do. And that was New Jersey's plan. The big states hated it. All states having equal power is totally unfair to you if you're a big state. You have way more people than the smaller states, and if all men are created equal, how can a state with way fewer men have the same power as you? If you were in Congress and represented a big state like New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, or Virginia, you would not have liked this plan. That was a plan the small states liked. It was the only way to guarantee that if you were a small state, you would still have power in this new government. If it was based on population, if it was based on wealth, a small, poor state would not have much say at all, and so little that it really wouldn't matter. So small states were in favor of this. But they found out the medium states really weren't. It wasn't great for them either. Small states having equal power to the medium-sized states, we're talking the Carolinas, we're talking about Connecticut here as a medium-sized state, Maryland as well. If that's the system we were going to use, it means that a little state like New Hampshire would have equal power to Connecticut, who was like 3 times its size population-wise. And yeah, Connecticut would have equal power to Massachusetts. That was good. So they kind of saw the best but also the worst of both worlds. And they all kind of thought, yeah, this is still going to give the big states too much power, so we don't like that. But we don't like the small states having too much power either. So medium states didn't like New Jersey's plan. And the result? Not enough states supported it, so it failed. Virginia had its own plan. They wanted 2 Congresses. That was to make sure that if one made a bad decision, the other could be there to kind of stop it from happening and have decisions have to be approved by both Congresses for them to actually be official. But they wanted those Congresses to be identical and that power in both of the Congresses being based on population size. If all men are equal, big states need more power. And that argument makes sense. You can't say that they're wrong here. Selfish, sure, because they are big states. But wrong? Well, no. If you are looking at a state, or a nation rather, that does have the principle that all men are equal, then states with more men must be represented with more power. Because you can't count 1,000 men equal to 10,000. Now, of course, later on we adapt that to all people being equal, but at the time they're just looking at men. Big states like that, and it was fair, as we said. Bigger states should have more power, but little states saw that as being a way that they would have no power. The big states were so big that they would dominate every decision, and small states wouldn't matter at all. Sure, they'd have a voice and they'd have a vote, but it was worth so little that they may as well not have one. And medium-sized states didn't really like this one either because that, while they did have more power than the small states, they would still be outnumbered by the great power of the Virginias and New Yorks and Massachusetts of the world, so they didn't like this either. And the railroads out there, states didn't support that, so it failed. So eventually, and you saw in the video this took a while, they did finally come up with a great compromise. That's what it's called. When you combine that idea. Have 2 Congress. Your first Congress is the lower house. It's called the House of Representatives. In that one, big states will get more votes, just like the Virginia plan says. But the second Congress, we'll call the Senate, will be using the New Jersey plan. All states are equal. They all get 2 votes, regardless of wealth, size, or anything else. And if you want to make a law or a policy, if the government wants to do something, both the House and the Senate would have to approve that. So it's not biased toward the big or the small states. It gives everybody input in both places. In one, the big states have more say, but in the other, the small and medium-sized states have more say. This was not popular at first, but when the folks in Philadelphia realized that they really had nowhere else to go, this is the only way of doing things fairly, they adopted it. And no surprise that it was Roger Sherman from Connecticut, who you're seeing the state pictured here, who supported this and proposed this. As a medium-sized state, he didn't like either the Virginia plan or the New Jersey plan, but felt that if you combine both of them, that gives everyone at least something, and it was a true compromise. And hence it was called the Great Compromise, and that's what we do. The thing is, though, if you're going to figure out how much power a state gets in that house where population matters, you got to count your population. That's called a census. So, since we now count population for one of our Congresses in the House, do we count slaves as part of that population? I need to fix this, and I'm going to. I should say, do we count slaves? If we did, states with slaves will see a rise in their percent of the population, which means they get more votes in the House. Those southern states would see themselves getting a little more power, where northern states would not. Northern states, therefore, hated this. Basically, they're thinking that slave states would get a reward they didn't deserve, because that would come at the expense of the northern states. Northern states would lose power, while southern states would gain power if you count slaves. Southern states, they'll like the idea. One, that maintains slavery stays a part of this new nation, which they wanted because of their economic ties to slavery. And 2, it's going to give you more votes. And since the South was smaller population-wise, except for Virginia, than the North, having a few more votes in the House would give the South more power and have them be very close to the power of the North. But there were some southern states that didn't want this, some of the smaller ones. You don't gain much power, and you're worried that this would imply that slaves are people. See, that's the other thing. If you're representing a southern state in Congress, you are worried about the idea that if we count slaves as people, the next step is going to be, well, then why don't they have rights? And if you start giving slaves rights, why, they won't be slaves anymore. They'll be free, and that will ruin slavery. So, one of the aspects the southern states thought about was, well, if we call slaves people, then they're going to have rights at some point, and that'll do it for slavery. Maybe later, they're thinking, but not right down the road. So the idea to count slaves as people kind of failed because not even every southern state was behind that, though they thought at first it would benefit them as far as power in the House is concerned. So, let's not count slaves as people at all then. Northern state says, well, that's better, but no, because see, if they don't count as anything, then they're not people. And if they're not people, they're no different than a cow or a bookshelf or any other piece of property in that they're owned and have no rights. And northern states, many of them, didn't want to concede in the idea that slaves were not people and therefore never had any rights. Those who had a moral objection to slavery, who felt it was wrong, especially wouldn't concede on that point. They really wanted to have slaves not be slaves and have them be able to exercise their rights. And if you call them property, they can't do that. Even southern states didn't like that completely because it wasn't terrible. It doesn't give them any more power in the House, which is what they really would like. And remember, the North is at an advantage over the South when it comes to power. Those northern states have more population, the 7 of them, than the 6 southern states. So southern states were looking for a way to kind of increase their power in the House a little bit to kind of make them more even with the North in that regard. The Senate didn't matter as much because every state was equal, but in the House, population matters. So these southern states, really, some of them did want to count their slaves. The solution? Another compromise. Can we give a compromise that allows each state some value for the House and save the real question of what is a slave, person, or property for later? If you decide a slave is a person or property now, you're going to alienate half the country, and you might have a civil war in your hands. And as you know, we can't survive a civil war at this point. England arrives as peacekeeper, and people would welcome them back to control the country again, making the entire independence movement a waste of time. So the solution is really not a very good one in the long term, but it works in the short term. Slaves are 3/5 of a person. That means for every 5 slaves your state has, we'll add on 3 to your population total of white men. That way, northern states don't have to say a slave isn't a person, because they somewhat are. And northern states will still have more power in the House, even if slaves count as 3/5 of a person, because the biggest states are still in the north. Southern states will, though, get a little more power in the House. And southern states can keep their slavery, as they don't have to consider slaves people, because, they're really kind of not. I like to say this kicks the can down the road. It doesn't solve the problem, but at least it allows the slavery issue to kind of be solved for now. And by that I mean you could put it aside, come up with a number as far as how many people does every state have, and use that to determine your population and percentage of power in the House, but you don't have to deal with slavery anymore, and you can get back to it later on when the country's stronger. Whether that was the right thing to do morally, well, I can see why you'd say, no, it wasn't. They should have been better at dealing with slavery now and taking a more hardline stance to end it because it's wrong. I can see why you'd say that, because slavery's morality is absolutely questionable. In fact, you can't defend the morality of slavery. It's immoral. However, at the same time, you could look at it in a way that these people were trying to make a country work, and civil war was the one way to make sure it wouldn't, and they were trying to avoid that at all costs. So you can make your own judgment of whether it's the right decision, this 3/5 compromise, but that's what they did to try to avoid a civil war, and in that regard, it worked. We'll have a civil war, but it's going to happen 80 years later. So, let's talk about trade. The next proposal was we should let the new National Congress, the House and the Senate, set the rules on trade, because right now states are competing with each other. Northern states loved it because their trade was not as lucrative. They weren't making as much money except for Massachusetts, who was very wealthy. But southern states didn't. They made more money, and of course they imported slaves. So we saw this one in the video. They needed a guarantee. North, if they wanted to, with their power in the House, could end slavery if they all united. And in the Senate, they probably could too in our new government, because at first there were 7 states in the North to 6 in the South. Now, we'll change that by adding 3 new states, making it 8/8, and no one has the advantage. But at first, the South felt vulnerable. They did, though, want to stop competing with each other and knew we needed to have our governments, all of us together, control our trade. So here was the compromise. The South agreed to let trade be controlled by our House and Senate, and all states would have input. But you can't end the slave trade for 15 years after that and 20 years from date of proposal. In other words, 1808. By then, you might not even need the slave trade. And if a state wanted to end it for itself earlier, they could do that. But the national government could not tell a state, no, you can't have the slave trade anymore. They couldn't do that until 1808. So, in exchange for conceding and admitting and allowing trade to be controlled by the House and Senate in all 13 of our states, the southern states got a guarantee that no one would touch their slave trade for 20 years. And that would allow them to keep it and slowly start to look to adjust to life after the slave trade. Turned out they really didn't need it. In 20 years, it wasn't much really for being necessary anymore, because you had so many slaves here. You didn't need to import anymore. The next proposal. Who's going to elect this House and Senate? Most of the people can't read, so we can't trust them to have full control over the House or Senate. There's way too much at stake to turn over the entire choice on who's going to lead us to the people. However, if you look at the idea, people need to have some power. So the first proposal was made, each state's legislature, every state had their own Congress, and that Congress was selected by the people. Let's let every state pick its House and Senate members, and let's let the state legislature do it so the people don't have direct say. It didn't matter here what type of state one was in deciding this. What happened in this situation was that all states kind of figured out that if this happened, people are going to look at our government a lot like they looked at England's and say, I don't have enough power in this government. And if that government taxes those people, they're going to have the same cry they had against the British, taxation without representation. And the answer would be, you are represented. You chose your state's reps who chose your House and Senate. They'd say, that's not good enough. I want to choose my House and Senate. So, you want to kind of answer the question, how do you give the people enough power so that they're satisfied and that they're being treated fairly and they have some input in their own decisions, but not enough to be dangerous? The solution here was another compromise. People voted to elect the House. They got to pick one of the 2 Congresses, the one based on population. The state legislature gets to choose the Senate. So people, you get full say over one, but no say over the other. And you'll still have indirect say over the Senate because you elect the state Congress who picks them, but you only get to pick one. Your state's Congress will pick the other. You have half the power, the state has the other half. That was a good compromise. That was a really good one to do overall, because what that allows people to do is to have enough power so that they have fair treatment, but not so much that they get to elect anyone they want to for both House and Senate. And when you can't read, you might be able to be easily duped by who you're picking. I'm going to stop this one for now because I'm going to pick this up with a second video once I find out whether or not we have a remote day or not. And if I do, there'll be a second slideshow that goes along with this. That'll be part 2. You can continue on that one if we have that remote day. So part 2 will be recorded and posted and put up there as well. So here's part 1. If we are watching this remotely or you miss class, you can start on part 2 right now.